Hi, folks. My name is Jerry DeSilva, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to a special event on the 150th anniversary of Charles Darwin's Descent of Man. On February 24th, 1871, Charles Darwin published The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, a follow-up to his most famous book on the origin of species. In the introduction to Descent, he wrote, "It has often been asserted that man's origin can never be known. But ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. It is those who know little, and not those who know much, who so positively assert that this or that problem will never be solved by science." In other words, Darwin proposed that the origin of humans was knowable. At that time, though, Darwin didn't know about DNA. The entirety of the human fossil record, which now numbers in the thousands of specimens, consisted of just a few Neanderthal bones, misidentified by many as diseased modern humans. Modern primatological studies of our great ape cousins were almost a century away. A lot has changed in 150 years. The anniversary of the publication of The Descent of Man is an opportunity for self-reflection in our quest for understanding how humans evolved, or what Darwin called a most interesting problem for the naturalist. To that end, a dozen of my colleagues and I have produced a book called A Most Interesting Problem, published by Princeton University Press, in which we review chapter by chapter what Darwin wrote in the first edition of Descent, comparing his words to what we now know a century and a half later. Contributors include Janet Browne, Alice Roberts, Susanna Herculano-Huzel, Brian Hare, Yohannes Haile-Selassie, Christina Kilgrove, John Hawkes, Agustín Fuentes, Michael Ryan, Holly Dunsworth, and Anne Gibbons. It turns out that Darwin was remarkably prophetic in some of his predictions. For example, that most of the earliest human fossils would be discovered on the African continent. But he was flat out wrong in other areas. That's how science works. Even the most elegant ideas can wither in the face of new evidence. Darwin did not present infallible statements to be revered in The Descent of Man. He offered hypotheses to be tested. Some of these ideas have withstood 150 years of scrutiny, and some have not. And that is what we will explore today. Each of our speakers will present for approximately 10 minutes, and we'll start with Harvard historian Janet Browne, who has written the definitive biography of Darwin. After Professor Browne establishes the historical context in which Darwin lived and wrote, anthropologists Brian Hare and Yohannes Haile-Selassie will critique Darwin's predictions using recent discoveries from studies of our ape cousins and from the rich hominin fossil record. We encourage those of you watching live on Facebook, YouTube, or Leakey Foundation Live to post questions in the chat during the presentations. And then we'll take your live questions before diving into part 2, in which anthropologists Agustín Fuentes and Holly Dunsworth discuss Darwin's many missteps in writing about human race and sex differences. After those 2 talks, I'll moderate questions from our viewers. We'll end our session with a bird's eye view of our field from award-winning science journalist Anne Gibbons, who will then moderate a discussion with all of today's participants. So I'm honored now to introduce our first speaker. Professor Janet Browne is the Aramont Professor of the History of Science at Harvard University. She has written a biography of Charles Darwin, a 2-volume masterpiece, Darwin Voyaging and Darwin, The Power of Place. In 2013, she wrote the introduction to a republishing of Darwin's Descent of Man, and she pens the introduction to our book, A Most Interesting Problem. Thank you for joining us today, Janet.
Thank you. Is it over to me, Jerry?
It is indeed.
Great, thank you. Hello, everybody. What a pleasure it is to join you today. As Jerry has already mentioned, 150 years is a long time in science. And we contributors to this volume have had a fascinating time looking backwards and asking ourselves, how have Darwin's ideas about humankind lasted, if they've lasted at all? And it's a very absorbing question because Darwin had an ambiguous relationship with the problem of human evolution. He told his friend and colleague, Alfred Russel Wallace, "It is the highest and most interesting problem for the naturalist." That's where we get our title from. And yet, as he also told Wallace, he intended to avoid any discussion of mankind in his Origin of Species because it was so surrounded by prejudice. And as it happened, in the Origin, he only mentioned mankind once or twice as an example of anatomical structures, and specifically and cautiously in the closing pages of the Origin of Species, saying that if his views were accepted, light would be thrown on the origins of man and his history. And just maybe a little historical note, in those days, of course, they used the word man to cover the whole of humankind. So in The Descent of Man, Darwin provided that missing half of the Origin of Species, the half of the book that he left out. And in it, he described what he knew about the emergence of humans from animal ancestors, the physical characteristics of different peoples, the development of language and the moral sense, the relations between the sexes in animals and in humans, and a host of similar topics that were intended to blur the boundaries between ourselves and the animal world. Jerry's shown you a picture of it already. It was a big, serious book in 2 volumes that would have hardly stirred the Victorian world if it had been about sponges or orchids or something else. But to describe human beings, Queen Victoria, Abraham Lincoln, Nathaniel Hawthorne, as little more than grown-up animals was dynamite in his time. And what I'd like to do today is briefly introduce you to the man who wrote this book. I feel that The Descent of Man reveals Darwin as a figure much more embedded in Victorian cultural context than was the case with his other better-known publications. He was aged 62 when The Descent was published. But already, as you can see from this image, he looked like an older man, a statesman of science, or a prophet, if you will. The beard is a very telltale sign of his ability to represent a prophet or a sage to his companions, to his colleagues and friends. He began his beard in 1862 to prevent eczema when he was shaving. But rather wonderfully, there are some passages in Descent where he writes about beards as a signal of masculinity, a secondary sexual characteristic for attracting female interest. So if any of you listening today are searching for a research project, I do think the subject of Victorian beards would make a very intriguing topic. At the time he wrote Descent of Man, Darwin was a wealthy man, living on private income and investments. He had never needed a job. You will know perhaps that he was married to his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, from the China Manufacturing Company of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, and was the father by now, by the time of Descent of Man, of a large family comprising 2 daughters and 5 sons. He owned a big house in the country and was already revered by his contemporaries as a famous figure. So we find him at home, here in the study that you can see on the screen today. We find him at home in the late 1860s, cautious, anxious, a little unwell, keeping in touch with the world primarily through correspondence, yet increasingly determined to explain how he thought humans fitted into the evolutionary system he had been working on ever since the Beagle voyage. The house ran like clockwork around his personal timetable. He worked in a private study that gave him the peace and quiet he deserved, and he walked and thought every day around the circular path, actually an oval path, at the end of the garden that he called his thinking path. His family was involved a lot of the time in his work. His daughter Henrietta helped copy edit this book, The Descent of Man. She had just got married. And she got married the same year as Descent was published, and she read the proofs for Darwin while she was on honeymoon. His son George contributed demographic material, and some of the other sons also helped out in different ways. Darwin's wife Emma apparently also read the manuscript, mostly out of curiosity, as she had done for The Origin of Species, although she wrote in 1871 that she regretted that it would once again push God further off. Those were her words. So there was, of course, huge public interest in finding out what Darwin had at last come to say about humankind. The book was about us, about human origins, but it also ambitiously covered anthropological diversity, the structure of human society, the progress of civilization, and many other matters in what we would now call cultural evolution. And Darwin's coverage is very well explored in our volume, and we'll hear some of it as we're going through our afternoon together, or through our time together. He drew a lot of material from contemporaries who worked in anthropology, in geology, in embryology, comparative anatomy, as well as from scholars in linguistics and social theorists. He didn't know much about fossil remains. All of that was to come. And not all of his views were acceptable to his contemporaries. Alfred Russel Wallace, for instance, strongly disagreed with Darwin's theory of sexual selection and wrote to him many times about it. One of the things I'd like to emphasize in this short talk is that Darwin's social ideas were distinctly of his time. Many of the ideas will now seem unfortunate to us. He believed in a hierarchy of biological races and thought that less well-adapted societies would likely be overrun, perhaps extinguished, by what he called more advanced cultures or nations. And he had in mind the elimination, or reduction at least, of Aboriginal peoples by white settlers, a situation he had anticipated during his time in Tasmania on the Beagle voyage. It's a very imperial kind of view. He believed that sexual selection was the basis for differences in male and female intellect. A very Victorian view, very 19th century view. And most notoriously, he put forward some ideas, not in any kind of a coherent system, that encouraged his cousin Francis Galton to promote eugenics in the later years of the 19th century. In other places in the book, he used the word evolution in its modern sense. It's actually on page 2, if you get a chance to look. Darwin also used the phrase consistently throughout, survival of the fittest, which wasn't his. He had adopted it from Herbert Spencer in 1868. So it's perhaps this combination of outmoded historical beliefs with the many very forward-looking proposals that Darwin put out in the volume that make Descent of Man such a resonant document. And my colleagues in this book explore these issues with very great sophistication and aplomb. Ariel, we're ready for the next set of slides. Thank you. So in important ways, the Descent of Man extended and intensified the controversies that had followed The Origin of Species. Few 19th century readers wished to place human beings on the same level as what they considered beasts. What other question, apart from politics, could have generated such controversy in the 19th century intellectual world? The controversies have remained, although obviously different in content and kind. And here in the images that I just want to show you is how the satirical journals of Darwin's day greeted publication. There were amusing caricatures, of which I've got 2 or 3 to show you, that represented Darwin either chatting to an ape, as if it were his brother, or reflecting an apish image in a mirror. And I'd like to leave you today with this image from the magazine called The Hornet that I think sums up much of the debate to come that followed publication of The Descent of Man. Darwin is himself portrayed as an ape. We'll get there in just one moment. Maybe not. Darwin is portrayed as an ape, as an orang-utan in this instance, and it's neatly symbolic to me, and that's what I want to leave you with, that he is shown in that image as the actual embodiment of his own theory. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you to Ariel and the Leakey Foundation for organizing this event, and thank you for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Janet. That was fantastic. I have so many questions for you, but they'll have to wait. And if you do have questions, please enter them in the chat, and we will get to those after our next two speakers. So I am thrilled now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Browne Hare. Browne is a professor of evolutionary anthropology at Duke University. His interest in the evolution of social behavior has inspired research on humans' closest ape relatives and also humans' best friend, the dog. He has co-authored 2 books with Vanessa Woods, the 2012 New York Times bestseller, The Genius of Dogs, and the recently published, absolutely brilliant must-read, Survival of the Friendliest. So please welcome Browne Hare.
Thank you, Jerry. It's a pleasure to be with you and to follow Janet's amazing introduction. I had the pleasure of trying to review chapter 3, which is a comparison of the mental powers of man to the lower animals. And I think in this chapter, which is 2 parts, and I reviewed the second part, it really is trying to take on this big problem of where does morality come from, which I think was a lot of what Darwin was so anxious about in trying to explain humans, because effectively what he does in this chapter is replace a divine being that gives humans morality with a purposeless natural process. What a radical idea. And I know that it was one he was nervous about. And I imagine that's what his wife was commenting on in the quote that Janet used of, God being out more. So I think that in the chapter, what he does is he makes the case that, which is counterintuitive given how survival of the fittest is probably the most often phrase that is associated with evolution and Darwin. It's counterintuitive because in this chapter, actually, he makes the case that it's really survival of the friendliest. And if we can go to the slide, we have a wonderful quote where he actually says very succinctly that kindness and friendliness is really going to be a winning strategy in life. And so I have a slide of penguins because they're a great example of the only terrestrial vertebrate that lives year-round in Antarctica. And they do that with a little known trick that involves friendliness. They have to huddle together in the cold, cold winters, and they are actually attracted to each other and stay very close together to stay warm during the winter. It's a type of friendliness where everybody benefits by staying together. And contrast that with most birds like pigeons on a power line, and they like to keep space. They like to be apart. So the idea is that these types of friendliness or even up to compassion can be incredibly powerful in leading to survival and success of different species. And so in this chapter, he tries to make the case for the fact that friendliness can win. And if we go to the next slide, he also there we go. He also makes the case that animals can teach us a lot about where human morality comes from. The idea being that actually there are building blocks in animals, and those building blocks are going to be documented through careful study of animal behavior. So he listed building blocks as being everything from sympathy, regret, reasoning, social learning, self-command or self-control, as we might call it today, and even love. He predicted or anticipated that in later science, we would discover evidence for these types of emotions, feelings, abilities, and those would be the building blocks that natural selection would act on to then lead to human morality, and then could provide the sort of grist for theories of how you could have a natural, purposeless process, create a species that has the moral system and eventually even religious systems that we see today. So what I want to do for the rest of my time is just give a few examples, because in my chapter, what I outline is that I take those 6 sort of ingredients and I say, well, what about those building blocks? Is there evidence for those building blocks? And I think the last 20 years, actually, of research on animal psychology and animal behavior has revealed a lot of evidence that's consistent with the notion that animals, to a degree, actually have those building blocks. And so I want to walk you through a few examples of those. And my first one has to do with sympathy. So enjoy sharing, they're motivated to share with others. And in the case of bonobos, what's really interesting is they actually prefer to share food with strangers, with complete strangers. And we even have some evidence that some animals will share when it has no benefit to themselves. And it may be that they actually are feeling sympathy for the other individual they're sharing with. So this was something that Darwin thought, based on his many observations of animals, from his dogs to all his trips around the world, that we might see later. And here we have some nice evidence today from a variety of sources. So my next one is he makes the case for the need for self-command or self-control. The idea being, for instance, if you're going to be a moral being, sometimes you have to bury down your own selfish interest to then do things for others. So you have to have self-control. You have to say, well, I really want to, be aggressive, or I want to hurt this person, but that's not right. I should not do that. I ought not do that, because that wouldn't be morally okay, given the norms of my society. If morality is going to have an evolutionary theory, there has to be an idea of how that self-control evolved. So my next example is another bonobo, again, the species that's one of our 2 closest living relatives, and it's faced with a problem where it could really quickly try to grab some food through a window, but if it does, it's going to knock the food flying, and it has to realize that it actually has to take a detour. So you'll see what Benny the bonobo does here in this next video, and Darwin's quote on self-command.
Here, up here. You did so well. Let's do it again. Wow. That's amazing. That's truly amazing.
No.
Okay.
To do this, he just basically recognized or realized that he needed to take a detour in order to solve this problem. Okay, so my final example of Darwin's theory, or his ideas of building blocks, my final example where there's now new evidence in support of his ideas, and literally the evidence is 10 years old. The next one has to do with love. So if you can go to the next, there we go. So I love this quote. If Darwin was famously a lover of dogs, and a lot of his ideas informed by thinking about domestication and the animals on Downhouse. And I have that picture of the young woman staring deeply into the eyes of that dog, because the big discovery is that there is what's known as an interspecies oxytocin loop between dogs and humans. And to translate that, basically, as humans and dogs interact physically, or we make eye contact with each other, the exact same physiological response that leads to social bonding between parents and offspring of our own species occurs between humans and dogs. So the same neural hormone known as oxytocin is actually increased in humans and dogs as they're interacting either physically or by making eye contact with one another. It's the same neural hormone that leads to bonding between adult and human child, dogs effectively have evolved to hijack that bonding pathway so that we feel the same way, the same social bond that we feel with our own infants. So do we love our dogs? Do our dogs have the same sort of physiological response to us that we have to them? Yes. So there's a testable hypothesis and idea that has just been pursued in the last 10 years to suggest that there is a way to think about the evolution of love in non-humans. And so that building block that Darwin outlined, we have an amazing way forward to think about in the future. And so that's my final example of his building blocks that he highlighted as really potential ways to build a theory of morality that could be explored as a product of natural selection as opposed to some other being or supernatural process. So, I mean, in the period that Darwin's writing, you could see even today, this is a nerve-wracking idea to propose, but it has been testable. There is a lot of support for it at this point. So in this chapter, I really kind of conclude saying that I was just unbelievably impressed going back and looking at this in detail, because he's writing this before there is a field of psychology. He's writing this before there's any genetics, and even bonobos had not been discovered as a species. He outlines these building blocks that really are an important component of almost every theory of human morality, whether it's a psychological theory or a philosophical theory. There'll be building blocks by different names, but ultimately, I think he got a lot right in this chapter. So it was really fun to see.
Thanks so much, Brian. I am so happy to hear that my dog loves me. That's real. I'm not just imagining that. That is fabulous, and we're getting some great questions from folks who want to hear more about that. And so we'll have an opportunity. Yes, that's right. Read the book, and we'll have an opportunity to ask some questions of both Janet Browne and Brian Hare after our next speaker. So thanks so much, Brian. Next, we will hear from Dr. Yohannes Haile-Selassie. Yohannes is the curator and head of physical anthropology at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and he has made some of the most significant early human fossil discoveries in the history of paleoanthropology. In 2013, he helped design the stunning and innovative new Human Origins Gallery at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. So please welcome Yohannes Haile-Selassie.
Well, thanks, Jerry. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to contribute to this wonderful book. And I also want to thank the Leakey Foundation for organizing this event, celebrating the 150th anniversary of Charles Darwin's Descent of Man. So what I did for this book is publish this chapter 4 of this book, which I entitled Charles Darwin and the Fossil Evidence for Human Evolution. And this was a review of Darwin's chapter 2 in Descent of Man, which he entitled On the Manner of Development of Man from Some Lower Form. So this is the chapter where Darwin delves deeply, among many other things, into why we are unique, and where he identifies at least 5 major characteristics that distinguishes humans from other primates: bipedality, tool use, smaller canines, large brain, and hairlessness. This was also based on his embryological, anatomical, and behavioral observations of various extant animals, which led him to argue that humans evolved in the same manner as other species. However, there were no fossils for him to study of these early human ancestors and further investigate, for example, the origin of bipedality, or when in our evolutionary history our canines got smaller. So I start my chapter by quoting Charles Darwin, where he says, quote, "The free use of the arms and hands partly the cause and partly the result of man's erect position, appears to have led to an indirect manner to other modifications of structure. The early male progenitors of man were probably furnished with great canine teeth, but as they gradually acquired the habit of using stones, clubs, and other weapons for fighting with their enemies, they would have used their jaws and teeth less and less, end quote. He continues in another section in the same chapter where he says, quote, as the various mental faculties were gradually developed, the brain would almost certainly have become larger, end quote. Today, we have like 150 years later, we have so many fossils of our ancestors dating back all the way to 6 million years ago, almost close to the split, the time of the split from the common ancestor we shared with chimpanzees. But we're still trying to figure out how the selective pressures, what are the selective pressures for the origin of bipedality were. Why did our ancestors descend from trees down to the ground and evolve this odd way of locomotion? For Darwin, it was simply the free use of the arms and hands that was very important. This freeing of the hands was partly the cause, as he said, and partly the result of man's erect position. The question here is, was the primary selective pressure to freeing the hands defense from danger on the ground? I think that's like the key question that we're still trying to figure out. According to Darwin, this freeing of the hands as a result of, or partly the cause for bipedal locomotion, was followed by reduction of the canine size, and ultimately our brains got larger. Now, 150 years later, we can ask ourselves, is this the sequence of events that took place in our evolutionary history? Or did our ability to use tools precede or coincide with walking on 2 feet, as Darwin suggested? Are modern humans a result of gradual transformation of a single lineage? Were there transitional forms, neither quadruped nor fully biped like humans, between our ancient quadruped forebears and us? These are like really critical questions. So these are really difficult questions to answer during Darwin's time. And I have to say that they still are, because we haven't answered all of these questions. But we have better understanding of some of them because of the fossil record that we have today. The fossil record today informs us that our evolution was not a simple transition from one form to another. For example, today we know that there were multiple lineages that existed in our evolutionary history. During the earlier Pleistocene, for example, between 2.6 to 1.5 million years ago, there were 2 different lineages of hominid ancestors. The Australopithecus lineage, which probably gave rise to our genus, and the Paranthropus lineage, a highly specialized group which eventually went extinct without any contribution to our lineage. This tells us that at times more than one early hominid species lived at the same time, and that our evolutionary history was not linear. Such occurrences of multiple species are now being documented even during earlier times, like between 3.5 and 3 million years ago. So from this time period, we see that hominid ancestors were not only diverse, but also adapted to different types of bipedal locomotor adaptation. Between 3.5 and 3 million years ago, one of the species that we have good knowledge of is Australopithecus afarensis, which is Lucy's species, which we know was bipedal like us. We also know that, yes, canines reduced their size through time, especially after 3 million years ago. And this time also appears to be coincident with the origin of our genus, the genus Homo. The earlier hominids before 3 million years ago, though, still had relatively large canines, much smaller than apes, but still large. What we see in the canines of these early hominids as a fundamental shift in the loss of the canine honing. We don't see any sign of canine honing among the earliest human ancestors like Sahelanthropus chadensis at 6 to 7 million years ago, or Ardipithecus cadaba at about 5.8 to 6 million years ago. So no signs of canine honing, even in the earliest representatives of our lineage. So the other thing that he talked about is increasing brain capacity. When it comes to brain size, we know from the fossil evidence that brain size started increasing drastically after about 2.5 million years ago, which is also coincident with the origin of our genus and tool making. Until about this time, brain size in our ancestors was less than 500 cc, which is comparable to modern apes living today. We can now see some correlation between tool making, new dietary adaptation, in other words, incorporation of meat as an important resource, and the beginning of brain enlargement comes about that time. So generally, Darwin identified all of the major characteristics that distinguish humans from other animals. What we're trying to do today, 150 years later, and of course, equipped with a tremendous amount of fossil evidence that Darwin did not have, is to better understand his ideas and further refine the sequence of events and the selective pressures that led to our emergence. Darwin literally laid the background for us to understand our origins. He literally told us where our earliest progenitors may be found, which is Africa. And surely that's where we're finding them. What runs in the mind of most of us today is whether Darwin would have understood human evolution differently if he had all of the fossils that we have today. Could he have identified fossils like the 4.4 million year old Ardipithecus partial skeleton or the Botelli partial foot as transitional forms? Then when he finds out that Lucy's species and another species coexisted in close geographic proximity, how would he have interpreted such occurrences? There is no doubt that he might have considered his ideas in some areas, such as on the mechanisms of and evolutionary sequences, but may not be that much. He would have figured out most of it. So finally, before I finish, I want to say that in my opinion, I think bipedal adaptation was probably not the best adaptation in the beginning, especially when I think about the amount of skeletal modifications that they had to undergo. And meaning to attain full erect posture, it only paid off once our ancestors developed tool making and their brain got larger and larger to eventually make them the most dominant group living on our planet today. Let me finish by saying we still have a lot to learn about our evolution as we continue finding more fossils in Africa and elsewhere, and build on what we learned from Darwin about 150 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yohannes. One of the things I think about a lot is just what Darwin's reaction would be if he could see some of the fossils that you found, and just to hand him that Australopithecus anamensis skull that you reported on last year, or Artie, right, or Lucy, to see any of these fossils, and how that would have just blown his mind. And he would have been so excited to see something like that. So now we have an opportunity to answer some of the questions that you have as you've been watching this presentation thus far. And so make sure you enter your questions into the chat. One of the questions that's come up from Emily Hart and Patty Goodhart, both of them wrote about, for Brian, asking about the oxytocin loop in other animals. Are there other non-human primate species that have this oxytocin loop? Is there interspecies empathy? And everyone wants to know about cats. Do cats love us too?
Okay, well, let me start with the non-human oxytocin loop in other species like primates. There is a new paper just out, I believe, yesterday, from Nick Grebe and Christine Dre here at Duke University, looking at monogamous lemurs. And the argument is that their oxytocin system has been shaped dramatically in a way that allows them to bond. I don't know if they go so far as to argue for an oxytocin loop, and I haven't had a chance to even read the paper. But just to say that there are people actively working on this and testing the idea that different social systems are shaped by the alteration of this physiological pathway. On the harder question of cats, so cats and oxytocin loop, I cannot touch a paper that I am aware of that anybody's looked at this. But I would imagine that maybe there's something going on there. Part of the challenge doing research on cats is we have wolves that we can compare dogs to. They share a last common ancestor. The cat progenitor species doesn't live in captivity anywhere. There's only individuals in the wild. And so I just don't know. I don't know if that's something that's been shaped as a result of domestication. But I hope other people will be inspired to study oxytocin and whether cats truly do love us.
Thanks, Brian. And Janet, you asked the question in our private chat, but I want to sort of toss it back to you about Darwin's own dogs and his relationship with his own dogs and how that may have influenced his thinking on interspecies relationships and cooperation. So could you say something about the dogs that Darwin had?
Oh, I would love to, and we could write a whole other book about his dogs. He loved dogs. He could leave cats. The family had cats, but he liked dogs. And he had a dog from, as a child. He had a dog at university. There was a dog that they adopted on the Beagle voyage that lived on board. And he's had dogs ever since, all the way through his life, and he just loved them. So the book that we're not talking about today was called On the Expression of the Emotions of Animals. And there the dogs feature quite extensively as being part of his theory. But the question that you asked was, did he love his dogs? The answer is very simple. Boy, did he love his dogs. Yes, he did.
Thank you. That's fabulous. Yohannes, we had a question from Michael Collins, who asked, how important do you think throwing of objects, such as rocks for hunting, predator defense, so how important was the ability to throw rocks? How important was that in human evolution? And he added in what W.H. Calvin called action at a distance predation.
Well, I don't think we can reject the significance of these characteristics. It's all about the timing. Did early human ancestors start hunting like early on, like right after the split from the common ancestor with chimpanzees? Or is this a behavior that developed later on through time? So that comes to the point of talking about when did early human ancestors actually start using tools of some sort, whether it's by throwing rocks or modifying wood or bones to protect themselves from danger, or to utilize it as a means to get into resources. So for us, the key question is about timing. When did they start it is the key question. Otherwise, there is no doubt that they have used those kinds of tools either to protect themselves from danger or to procure resources as needed. But the key question that we are still trying to figure out is, when did that start? Because we have a lot of evidence for the later time after the origin of the genus Homo, particularly if you talk about hunting or actually utilizing the hunting abilities to procure food, we can show some evidence after the emergence of our genus. But for what happened before that, how they were using rock throwing or things like that, it is still conjectural. We can say that they probably did use those kinds of techniques, but when it started is still a question in debate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we have time for one more question, and those of you who are submitting questions, I'm seeing great ones come across my screen. Well, we only have time for one more here with this group, but we're going to meet these folks again at the very end. Ann Gibbons is going to moderate another discussion with everyone, and so you're going to have a chance to ask your question again. What I want to ask Browne and Yohannes and Janet is think 150 years from now. And scholars 150 years from now writing, the next version of the book, the 300-year anniversary of Descent of Man. What are the big questions? What questions do we have in our discipline right now that we don't have an answer to right now? That we're trying to figure out as scholars.
I can take a stab, at least from the perspective of thinking about cognitive evolution. I think where we've made a lot of progress is thinking about those building blocks, and are there actual building blocks that natural selection could act on? And I think there we've got some evidence. Sure, we can still debate about how good that evidence is or what the building blocks are. But I think where we're really, really at an infancy is how natural selection actually acts upon those building blocks to shape them into something that would end up being human morality, because all those building blocks in humans, and Darwin makes this point, they actually work together, whereas other species might have evidence for one of the building blocks or two of the building blocks, but not all of them working together in concert. So how natural selection does that, I think we're at the very, very beginning of that.
Great. And Yohannes, what about you? What do you think we still haven't got figured out?
Well, I would say that even today, we haven't figured out why we evolved this weird way of locomotion bipedality. There are so many hypotheses in terms of why we became bipedal, but none of them seem to be like, the end of it. Every hypothesis is testable sometimes, but some other times you cannot really test it. So Darwin thought that like the freeing hands was like why we're bipedal, but obviously the one thing that we're still trying to understand is why descend from the trees to the ground, right? Why did we become bipedal? Why didn't we stay up on the trees? And why are the only animal that walks on this weird locomotor adaptation walking on two legs? So if we can figure that out like in 150 years and talk about it like this is why, then that would be a great advance in our field.
Yeah, it keeps me up at night, Yohannes. It's the one I try to figure out. And Janet, what about you? I mean, you've thought about Charles Darwin so much. What questions do you still have about this man and his life?
I think the one that if I was still alive in 150 years' time, the one that I would really be engaging with very substantially, would it still be as a historian, would be how Darwin's celebrity contributed to the acceptance of the theory, that he became enormously famous 150 years ago. His fame has only increased in the 150 years. And here we are. It was his birthday yesterday. We have a book celebrating one of his publications. I would be really interested to know if we're still doing that in 150 years' time. And if we are doing that in 150 years' time, what it is that Darwin would be doing for us then, as he is doing for us now. Okay.
That's great. Thank you so much, Yohannes, Browne, and Janet. We're going to move on to part 2 of our program, but we will see you all again at the very end. So thank you so much. It is my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Agustín Fuentes. Agustín is a professor of anthropology at Princeton University, and he is the author of the 2012 Race, Monogamy, and Other Lies They Told You, the 2017 book, The Creative Spark, and most recently in 2019, Why We Believe, Evolution and the Human Way of Being. In 2018, he delivered the prestigious Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh. Thank you for joining us, Agustín.
Jeremy, thank you so much. And thanks to the Leakey Foundation for organizing this together. And Jerry, again, for putting us all together in this really wonderful book. I encourage everyone to read this. The first section was wonderful. And it really, I think, drove home some of the incredible benefits and interesting patterns in Descent of Man. Unfortunately, that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm, in fact, going to reflect on Chapter 7 The Races of Man, On the Races of Man by Charles Darwin in Descent of Man, where it is clear that Darwin is an amazing scientist, and we know this from all of his work, that he has the capacity to be compassionate and caring and a really insightful observer, but he was also racist. Chapter 7 on the races of man in Descent shows us the power of racism, the power of white supremacy and privilege in obscuring data and corrupting the scientific enterprise. And that's its power. But I'll come at the end to a little bit of hope, because I think there is something in Darwin's treatment here that offers us an important piece of hope. So Darwin, On the Races of Man in chapter 7, he first tackles the monogenous versus polygenous argument. The whole notion that at his time, there was a debate whether or not all of the races, the different groups of humans, as they were called, and as they are still called today in a very similar and equally incorrect manner, different sort of biological lineages, whether they all came from the same origin or whether they had separate origins. So monogenism was they're all from one group, and polygenism is they had separate independent organisms. Darwin clearly in this chapter lays out a very, very strong case for monogenism, that all humans living today have the same common ancestor. So that's actually very important. However, Darwin's travels, Darwin's engagement, and all of the data that he had drew him to the following statement. There is, however, no doubt that the various races, when carefully compared and measured, differ much from each other, as in the texture of their hair, the relative proportions of all the parts of their body, the capacity of the lungs, and the form and capacity of the skull, even the convolutions of the brain. The races differ also in constitution, in acclimatization, in heritability, and liability of certain diseases, and in their mental characteristics. So Darwin believed that the races did vary, Black, white, Asian, African, European, Asian, but he always ranked them in hierarchy, created sort of a hierarchy where he would say even the most distinctive races, with the exception of certain Negro tribes or certain sub-Saharan African groups, he constantly ranked those individuals from Africa as less than all other races, and ranked the variety of different races. But what's very interesting is at the same time that Darwin is making these kinds of distinctions and differences, he says, and through his own experiences, and here I'll quote again, "The American Aborigines, Negroes, and Europeans differ as much from each other in mind as any three races can be named. Yet," and here's Darwin saying, "yet I was incessantly struck while living with Fuegians aboard the Beagle with the many little traits of character showing how similar their minds were to ours." And he goes on to say, "And so it was with a full-blooded Negro," and I'm sorry to use this term, but these are the terms that Darwin used, "with whom I happened to once be intimate." And this, here he's talking about John Edmonston. And this is an individual that Darwin worked with while he was at the University of Edinburgh, who he paid to teach him taxidermy and about South American flora and fauna. John Edmonston was a Surinamese man living in Edinburgh, well-educated in teaching. When Darwin says of John Edmonston, he was a pleasant and intelligent man. So Darwin believed that races occurred, that they were distinguished and different, and there were a hierarchical relationship between them, that there were biological differences, even though we had a common shared ancestor. And then he goes on in this chapter to try to sort of explain where these differences come from. And he says, "If, however, we look at the races of man as distributed over the world, we must infer that their characteristic differences cannot be accounted for by the direct action of different conditions of life, even after the exposure to them for long periods of time." He then goes on to, after recounting more evidence, "nor can the differences between the races of man be accounted for, except to a quite insignificant degree by the inherited effects of increased or decreased use of parts." And he finally goes on to say, "None of the external differences between the races of man have any direct or special services to them." What Darwin points out through his sort of analysis in this chapter is that natural selection or functional patterns or differences simply do not explain hair color, face form, skin color, these kinds of things. He clearly has the data that show that his evolutionary model, right, indicates that human variation is not the kind of difference that emerges through evolutionarily functional components. But of course, he says the intellectual, moral, and social faculties must be accepted from this remark. And what Darwin is arguing here is that here's a bunch of data. Nothing that I understand about natural selection explains the differences in these races, but there must be differences there, and they're most likely in the intellectual and moral and social facilities. He goes on in his chapter to argue to basically in support of the genocide and the horrible violence at the colonial and imperial moment, with whole groups of people being wiped out, arguing that this is just a logical sort of conflict between races. And he argues that when races conflict, those races that are more civilized, in this case meaning Western European groups, will win. So, I mean, there's a lot of problems with this, but why do I sort of narrate these comments and these discussions in Chapter 7? And we'll have plenty of time to talk about the details in the Q&A. I present these discussions because as you read Chapter 7, you see Darwin marshaling a large amount of data and evidence that clearly shows that there are not functional differences between these groups of people, that these differences in phenotype and morphology and a variety of other things are superficial and do not explain deep biological differences in capacities. And Darwin himself, through his own experiences in Edinburgh with John Edmonstone and on his voyage on the Beagle, meeting the Fuegians, meeting peoples from around the world, notes that these are people just like me. And yet, Darwin doubles down on explanations of difference, on denigrating comments about groups of people from sub-Saharan Africa, and in the justification of the genocide and slaughter as a logical outcome of evolutionary processes. So in the current day, we could look back at what Darwin is presenting and we can say, absolutely, what do we know? Well, we know that continental types are not biological units. We know that Black, White, Asian are not biological units, that race is not biological, but rather a social construct, and that race and racism over the last 500 years have become very dominant patterns and processes of oppression, of violence, of genocide, and that racism has direct harm and harmful impacts on the bodies. So why is this important? Why should we care about Darwin's racism? Darwin's racism is important because today white supremacists and racists draw on Darwin's actual words from Chapter 7 in Descent of Man to support their assertions. They say, look, Darwin, this incredible scientist, this founder of evolutionary theory for many, said this, right? Said things about the inequality of races and specifically targeted sub-Saharan African peoples as less than. That's why this is important. Now, I believe, because Darwin was such a good scientist, we have so much evidence of all the scientific research that he'd done and the meticulous knowledge that if he looked today, if he was around today, 150 years after the publication of Descentus, if he was around today and he looked at the data available about human biological variation, human genomic variation, and all of the kinds of patterns that we can look at to understand how humans vary and why they vary, he would clearly understand and assert not that we don't understand why these differences are there, but they must be real. He would say, no, race is not a biological reality because the data are so robust, and he was an incredible scientist. But in his day, and today, many just like him are great scientists, are very intelligent people, but are committed to a particular worldview that is racist and that is structured around white supremacy, which disables their ability to see what is actually in front of them and what they actually presented. The data in Chapter 7 are actually sufficient to refute the idea that races are biological lineages of humans, and yet Darwin, for his own bias, right, is unable to see it. The hope is today, with so much knowledge and so much understanding, we reflect now, and if we were to write on the races of man today, we can clearly demonstrate that race does not come from biology, but racism has huge biological impacts. And I think many of the tools that we use to make those statements and to understand them, the science behind what I just said, actually does in some ways come from Darwin and influences us in very positive ways. So while Darwin was indeed racist, we can learn from the patterns and processes of science and the engagement and the deep commitment to knowledge and reflect on our own biases and our own constraints in how we engage with and think through what the natural world looks like and how we make that social, political, and economic reality for everyone else. I think that's about my time, unless I have an extra minute.
Agustín, thank you so much. There is some real hard truths in reading chapter 7, but I love how your chapter is brilliant, and it ends on this important note that Darwin, as a scientist, reading the data that we currently have, knowing what we know about him as a scientist, like you said, he would reject the idea of race being biologically based. And that it's but racism having biological impacts.
Absolutely. And I just, before I disappear, want to point out, it was well known that Darwin and his family were abolitionists, but one can easily be abolitionist and a racist. And I think that's an important thing, the complexity of white supremacy and these sort of notions of privilege and context. We have to reflect on them and think with them and go for, as you pointed, the science itself.
Yeah. In fact, Sheila Poole, I'm seeing right now, asked that very question. Wasn't he an abolitionist? And so that timing couldn't have been better of that question and you making that statement. Thank you so much. And we'll see you in just a moment, right after our next speaker. Our next presenter is Dr. Holly Dunsworth. Holly is a professor of anthropology at the University of Rhode Island, and her work challenges the traditional, often male-biased and Eurocentric narratives of human evolution with exquisite clarity. She has contributed to NPR's This I Believe series, and her posts to science blogs, The Mermaid's Tale and Origins are must-reads. She is currently writing a book with the working title, I Am Evolution. Holly, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm thrilled to be part of this with you and with all of you tuning in. And thank you to the Leakey Foundation for putting this event together and for all the extraordinary work that in the world that you do. So until we wrote this book with Jerry, I just saw Descent of Man as the source for Darwin's formulation of sexual selection and his argument for our place in nature by relating us to animals across the animal kingdom. What I hadn't done until I wrote my chapter was pay much attention to Darwin's ideas about humans specifically. I had only peeked at a few of those pages, had seen the word savages, and then couldn't bear to actually pay attention. What for? Being based on such outdated and limited evidence, those pages wouldn't advance my understanding of human evolution. So I didn't think they were worth my time. But to write this chapter, I had to give those pages my time. And while I read and reread and raged, I realized what I already knew but hadn't yet faced. Descent of Man's greatest legacy is not the scientific power of sexual selection. It's Darwin's, or man's place in nature. Instead, it's Darwin's racist and sexist narratives of human evolution. Descent of Man is just the absolute pits for so many people like me. His book was better for birds, beagles, baboons than it was for billions of humans. So, for scientists, Descent of Man is a foundational theoretical masterpiece, albeit riddled with errors that Darwin can be forgiven for making in his time, without these 150 years of scientific progress that we enjoy today. But for humanity, Descent of Man, Darwin's book, has been a curse. So the scientific value of Descent of Man is impossible to untangle from the oppression that it inspired. Darwin's scientific contributions in chapters 19 and 20 of Descent of Man, they look like Victorian age appropriate explanations for sex differences in visible traits in peoples across the globe, like for how our naked, colorful skin developed out of our ape ancestry. Because around the world, men tend to be darker skinned than women, Darwin proposed that variation in human skin color around the world evolved due to sexual selection via local beauty standards. But that people with deep ancestry in the tropical regions of the planet have some of the most pigmented skin is best explained by natural selection, not sexual selection. This adaptation likely materialized as our hominin ancestors lost a significant amount of their protective fur covering. In its place, a melanin-rich epidermis shields the body from the sun's harmful UV rays, particularly at the equator. At high latitudes, natural selection is also the dominant explanation for human skin color today. Our bodies require UV radiation to synthesize vitamin D. So permitting some UV radiation into the skin is beneficial. Both skin color extremes have strong adaptive explanations. In between UV extremes, that clinal spectral continuous variation from highly pigmented to depigmented skin is maintained by gene flow connecting the populations and by selection for intermediate UV levels in between. Selection based on intermediate UV levels in between. The evidence for this explanation for the evolution of skin color variation around the world, for this natural selection explanation, outweighs the evidence for Darwin's hypothesis of sexual selection via different beauty standards. One of the strongest testaments to Darwin's influence is that the mere existence of sex differences is enough to assume that sexual selection brought them about. Take, for example, sex differences in human height, where in all populations, men are on average taller than women. Darwin drew inspiration from the size and strength of male or silverback gorillas, and scientists in his wake have helped to build the case, which is now canon, that sexual selection explains sex differences in body size. Big males won greater mating opportunities by physically dominating competitors and mates, and by females preferring to mate with those big winners. So the thinking goes. But sex differences in human height are at least as much about the evolutionary importance of estrogen. Estrogen is a major driver of long bone growth in all humans, and it's biphasic. So at even higher levels of estrogen, it ends long bone growth with the fusion of the growth plates. When estrogen peaks, teenage girls stop growing. This estrogen peak at puberty is fundamental to ovarian development and the initiation of regular menstrual cycling. Boys who are growing in step with girls until puberty, they stop gaining stature just a few years after girls do because there is nothing to stop them earlier. High estrogen would be incompatible with male reproductive development and function. Eventually, young men have enough estrogen in their more senescent skeletal system to also stop growing. There are no male or female genes for height, and there are no male or female bones. There is only common human biology of skeletal growth shared among humans, where similar processes significantly controlled by estrogen play out differently in different bodies during development. So as of now, sex differences in the duration of long bone growth are a byproduct of the way that the human reproductive system evolved to function, thanks in large part to estrogen. Still, sexual selection for tall men dominates the evolutionary story. It sure is a compelling story. Perhaps more than any other science, evolutionary science is a collection of stories or fictions about facts. For example, fact: men are on average taller than women. Fiction, because of their big winning male forebears. Fictions are supposed to be difficult to establish as fact in science, and they're far too easy to establish as fact in the zeitgeist. If we are better aware of the precarity of our fictions, if we improve the scientific explanations of visible physical sex differences like height, then that science will be less likely to inspire unscientific beliefs about invisible, often imagined sex differences. Fewer minds will leap illogically from men are taller to men obviously evolved for competition and dominance, as if women did not. Underneath Descent of Man's ambitious scientific contribution to human evolution lies much more than surface beauty. This is Darwin begetting every caveman-inspired nugget of dating advice and every appeal to innate gender roles at home, in the workplace, in science and tech, on Wall Street. This is where Darwin first turned his concept of sexual selection loose on humans, launching the evolutionary narrative that dominates pop culture, starring, quote, the strongest and boldest men in contests for wives. In Descent of Man, Darwin parlayed visible anatomical differences between sexes, like those in skin color and height, into the evolutionary logic behind why man and wife perform differently in matters of love, sex, parenting, cognitive feats, comedy, and seemingly everything else according to the contemporary worldviews he continues to shape. But pop culture has been slow to adopt new knowledge that has complicated and overturned old facts in human evolution. Much of the novel insights on human evolution, including especially the evolution of human skin color variation, these have come from women, despite persistent beliefs that, like Darwin's, that, quote, man is more courageous, pugnacious, and energetic than woman, and has a more inventive genius. Darwin even concludes, as if by scientific logic, that, quote, man has ultimately become superior to woman. For Darwin, women were wives, but men were so much more than husbands, and this seeded his science of sex differences. From his view of life, Darwin penned nature's seal of approval. Darwin naturalized gender differences, made them biological, made them adaptive, and made them morally valuable. All of us suffer from bias, but powerful men seem to share one particular form of bias when it comes to our species' shared origin story. Führers and ex-presidents, their oppressive human evolutionary narratives sound a lot like Darwin's, which directly inspired the exclusion of women from higher education and from science. Today, there is an increasing understanding that beliefs in gender essentialism, in natural, rigid gender stereotypes of masculinity and femininity, like boys are active and dominant, and girls are sexual and maternal. These beliefs are correlated to poor educational outcomes in boys and girls, and to sexual assaults by boys and men. Getting humanity's origin story right matters a great deal to humanity. The stories we tell about the facts of evolution are in dire need of diversity. The way to get there is not merely to be more correct or less biased than Darwin. It's not merely to be the best versions of ourselves. It is to be proactively bigger than any one person can possibly be, and to be proactively bigger than even science can be. We do not need science to demonstrate that women and people of color are not inferior, or to demonstrate that we are not less evolved, less brilliant and inventive, less deserving of opportunity, power, influence, admiration, and freedom than white men. While many scientists and scholars have met Darwin's bias and prejudice with science, science is not the only or even a necessary way to demonstrate humanity. That is partially because science does not represent humanity yet. Science will continue to write a better story of human origins and evolution. But if science were all it takes, then it would have that better story by now. Science is not the sole or even primary author of humanity's shared origin story. Humanity is. So let's write a great story together. Let's write one that's worthy of the entire species, a story that everyone can embrace.
Thank you, Holly. It was great. Thank you so much. It makes me think of Janet was talking earlier about his daughter Henrietta editing Descent, and just the cognitive dissonance it must have taken for him to have his daughter editing his work and valuing her input while still penning those words that you wrote about in chapter 19.
How much was her heart racing, like mine was just racing? How much sweat, literal sweat, did she pour into that?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that bias, though, is so powerful because Darwin himself writes about all of the experiences he had with other peoples and how they impressed him and how it made him feel and how he saw them as human beings and just like him. And yet the racism, right, the baked in white superiority found its way into the pages. And that's why, I mean, Holly's treatment of this was absolutely beautiful because the science doesn't do it all by itself, right? The data were there in Darwin's time. Darwin lays out most of the data in chapter 7, clearly saying, well, looks like nothing explains any functional difference between these groups of humans. So maybe it's sexual selection, sort of what he did with gender.
Right. I mean, with sexual selection, it's like, he made his hammer and everything becomes a nail, and he, started applying it to across the board. So one of the questions that came up that I think is an interesting one is, both of you talk about bias. You talk about blind spots that he had. Is there any way, as we, Holly, you're just talking about doing better, and how can we as a field and as a world, how can we do better? And yet it's going to take recognizing our own blind spots. And so Alice Corning asked the question of, at every age we're affected by current thinking, where might our current blind spots lie?
So,
or is that what makes them blind spots? Right?
Just to go back to what a theme we were just talking about, maybe, we all love science. That's why we're here with the Leakey Foundation, but science alone is not enough. And this emphasis on STEM is wonderful, but it is at the expense of the other valuable approaches to making knowledge and understanding our world that are necessary context for science. So the arts, the humanities, history, these are not as valued in a lot of realms, and yet if you're going to value science, you have to value those other things. Without context, there's nothing, and those are a big part of the context. The bias problem.
Yeah, these blind spots. Sorry, I didn't mean to run over you there.
I wanted to pass to you on high five.
The blind spots, that's or a person of their time. These are assertions that are made again and again and again. And so, that's what I tried to do in assessing chapter 7 on its merits. The data Darwin presents in chapter 7 clearly refute most of his assertions, if not all of them. At the same time that Darwin was writing, there were many scholars pushing against this notion of biological racism or hierarchy of races. And in fact, at the time Darwin was writing, I just heard a wonderful talk yesterday on Arabella Buckley, an incredible scholar who is the secretary of Charles Lyell, who wrote incredible books on mutual aid and engagement. So there were plenty of women and many individuals like John Edmonstone, who Darwin himself learned from, who are contributing to the broader science knowledge and all this, but are never credited, are never read, and very little discussed. And so we can say blind spots and we can say sort of people of their time, but that glosses over the real issues, which are these deep-seated intentional deployment of sort of racist and white superior or male supremacy contexts. And until we engage with those by having more diverse voices doing the science and more, it's not going to change.
So one of the things my students struggle with when I talk about human biological variation is I'll talk about Nina Jablonski's really pioneering work looking at the tug of war going on that Holly described between folic acid and, yes, exactly. We promote Nina's book. Thank you, Holly. This tug of war between folic acid and vitamin D that is a better explanation for human skin coloration or pigmentation differences that we see in humans across the world. And so in Holly's chapter, Darwin explained this through sexual selection, and it appears, as you said, much better than I'm saying right now, natural selection is a better explanation. And so I talk to students about let's demystify, human skin coloration. Let's talk about the mechanism, and it's really interesting. And then in the next sentence, I talk about race being a biological fallacy, and it confuses students because we just talked about skin coloration being founded on biological principles. So can you unpack that a little bit? How do you talk to your students about those two concepts?
I'm gonna let Agustín. You can.
Let me just jump in really quickly because you do this so well, Holly. I mean, the height thing I think is perfect, right? Because that lays it out. That is perfect. The skin color is great. So, and this ties into Darwin as well. So when the students are confused by, well, but if skin color is biological, aren't races biological? I'm like, no, because skin color is not distributed Africa versus Europe versus Asia. In fact, you see the actual distribution, biologically distributed geographic patterns of skin color, it doesn't define races at all. It has nothing to do with races. In fact, it doesn't work. That only is circumequatorial, as Nina Jablonski has so eloquently and wonderfully shown. So there's that. The other thing is, if you don't walk around the planet and see the range of human being, you have no idea what diversity looks like. And that was also true for Darwin. Darwin had very limited exposure to people, and he took just travelers' logs and, you know, Civil War doctors' reports and a variety of really shoddy data. And the thing is, we know Darwin could tell shoddy data. He threw it out all the time. He was a great scientist. But when it came to races, when it came to sex, he threw all his science out the window and made assertions because he knew them to be true. And so I think those things are important. Students need to know what variation actually is. Here's where data is important, but the data don't exist free, or they're not just there by themselves. You got to do stuff with them.
So this is great. I'm also reading questions that are popping up, and you are answering those questions as they're being asked without even hearing them. So thank you both. Holly, I mean, you ended your talk speaking about how we can do better. I'd like to hear both of you kind of talk about that a little bit more. As a scientific community, as a world, you know, how can we move forward here and not keep looking back at Darwin's ideas, or use those maybe to launch ourselves forward into a new world, and to see this vision that you have, to see it through. So how do we operationalize this? How do we do this?
I haven't planned it out yet. I don't have all the pieces. I just have a mindset that I'm working on with a lot of you, I know, and thanks to a lot of you. And it is, you know, it's just, so it starts to make less and less sense that we all have the same origin story, right? We all have our origin stories that are culturally based all around the world. Nobody doesn't have an origin story, a creation myth. And yet there's also one that unites us all. And that one that unites us all is so controversial. That's not okay. It's not okay. And it's not just controversial because of creationism. That is not the only obstacle. It is controversial because it's sexist and racist, and it doesn't need to be. It shouldn't be. And so we have to change it. And if I knew how to change it, I would answer your question right away. But I think this conversation is an important part of that. And changing the mindset maybe of science. Like, did science really think that when they came along and said, no, and here's another origin story, here's another creation myth, but this one trumps all yours, and this is the one, the way I'm saying it, Darwin or whoever, is how it's told. Did they really think that that was okay to do that to the world, to do that to all humans on the planet? I think they did, because they didn't think otherwise. So let's start thinking otherwise.
And one of the ways to think otherwise and to think with is to increase, as we've already said, increase diversity in the academic world, in the research world, in the world of power, of economics and politics, until we distribute power, knowledge creation and dissemination, yes, amongst the diverse reflection of what people actually look like and who people are racially, ethnically, gender. As we open up that spectrum and draw everyone into the actual creation of knowledge and dissemination of knowledge, that's how things change. And that's happening now, but it's slow and it's, tooth and nail. We need to do that. And that's how we make all of this better.
Yeah.
Thank you two so much. I could continue this conversation well into the evening, but we gotta move on. And again, Holly and Agustín will be back in just a moment, not too long after we hear from Ann Gibbons, who is our last speaker, and then Ann is going to moderate a conversation with all of today's participants. So we'll see Holly and Agustín again. There are some questions, some additional questions for you that hopefully we'll get to. So thank you two so much. So our final presenter today is Ann Gibbons. Ann is a contributing correspondent for Science magazine and the author of The First Human, The Race to Discover Our Earliest Ancestors. She has taught science writing at Carnegie Mellon University and has written about human evolution for National Geographic, Slate, Smithsonian Magazine, and other publications. She recently was awarded the 2019 American Geophysical Union's David Perlman Award for Excellence in Science Journalism. And it's so good to see you. Thank you so much for participating in today's session.
Well, it's my honor. And thank you to the Leakey Foundation for putting this event together. It's a lot of fun for me. And thank you to you, Jerry, for asking us to write these chapters. It was a great exercise to take time out of our busy lives to actually go back and reflect on what Darwin bequeathed to us. And I would say many of us have approached this as a thought experiment. So for me, I was lucky enough to actually tour Darwin's house, Down House, outside of London, and a few years ago, about 3 years ago, with 2 busloads of anthropologists. So that invited a really interesting thought experiment. I got sort of inspired by his dining room. Maybe we can show the slide of his dining room in the china there. In fact, a friend actually gave me the same, just a black and white version of the same china, which is a botanical pattern, which is wonderful, from the Wedgwood family. It made me think, oh my gosh, it would be so great if we could invite these anthropologists that are wandering around his grounds to sit down and actually have a conversation with Darwin. They could tell him what we've learned since his time and enlighten him to the new methods that have come up that have helped them test his ideas. They could tell him what is right and wrong. But, you know, beyond that, the other part of it is, why do we even care today what Darwin would think? Why do we care what this, you know, white upper class man thought about the origin and evolution of humans and our behavior today? And it reminded me of a quote by evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr, who said, most scientific ideas are far better understood by studying their history rather than their logic. So I'm going to argue that it's important to remind ourselves of Darwin's ideas, because he set the framework and gave us the lens through which we examine human evolution. He was the starting point. He made predictions and hypotheses that set an agenda for researchers to test. As such, he has influenced the direction researchers have gone in. He steered where they looked for fossils, what questions they asked about the evolution of behavior and traits. So it's really important for us to stop and take task. What did he get right? What did he get wrong? What did he miss? What were his biases? How have his ideas influenced what researchers have been doing over the last 150 years, and what they're still doing? Who is left behind? And our goal isn't to put him on a higher pedestal. It's not to make him more famous, but it's also, this book, I think what's important is to show how science works. Jerry talked about that at the beginning, how ideas evolve, how they emerge, how they evolve, and then how they're corrected. So we have to remember that science is this process of false starts, mistakes. It's the process of not getting things right, getting some things right, testing them. It's an ongoing, messy process, and that's what we're part of what we're celebrating here. So as I review people's talks briefly, how did Darwin do? Let's go through the scorecard a little bit. We start with Janet Browne. I could listen to her stories about Darwin forever. We learned today that his beard was a chick magnet. I mean, who knew about that? I didn't know that. A few other points she makes that are worth repeating. Darwin tried to show that human beings had gradually evolved from animals and that the differences were only of degree, not kind. That is just so fundamental, and it was such a radical idea at the time. He tried to show that there were no fundamental differences between man and the higher mammals, and mental faculties, also radical. But she also mentions that the descent of man shows Darwin at his most Victorian. He was a visionary, but he was still a man of his time, his place, and situation in life, with the same blind spots as other men of his time. And we'll come back to that. His book, she notes, is a mix of outmoded social ideas with forward-looking scientific hypotheses. I think that's a wonderful way to think of it. What it bequeathed us were some amazing ideas to test, but we have to remember the context of time that he was writing. So to see how he did on that, let's start with Bryan Hare first, who shows us how science has tested many of these hypotheses in animals. He gives us wonderful examples of bonobo's kindness to strangers, this wonderful little bonobo who shares her food because it's a way to make a new friend, even when she doesn't have to share all this delicious fruit. Of dogs and Arctic foxes who have become friendlier and more cooperative as they're domesticated. And we now know that dogs, the big breakthrough is that dogs' brains bask in oxytocin, this hormone that helps mothers bond with their babies. Dogs' brains are basking in this, and it gives them a high when they gaze into the eyes of their owners. And I guess we get the oxytocin as well. My vet once showed me how my dog's pulse slowed when I put my hand on her. And it's a wonderful notion to think that dogs aren't just waiting for us to feed them or get something out of us, but that they actually may have an emotional response to us. These studies, why are they important? Not just because we want to know more about our dogs, but they also give us hints about how our own species evolved to cooperate, how being friendly was beneficial, how we self-domesticated. Survival of the fittest is also survival of the friendliest in some species. When we're speaking of bonobos, dogs, penguins, and humans. So Hare shows us how the ingredients are building blocks of some of our most exalted behavior, our moral behavior, our emotions, language, even love, weren't just divinely bequeathed to us. The roots of these behaviors began in our animal ancestors and involved in us because they were adaptive, they were beneficial. So let's remember that next time our dogs lock eyes on us. Of course, Darwin came up with his ideas about human evolution without a fossil record, which is what Yohannes Haile-Selassie notes in his talk. He predicted correctly that our ancestors arose in Africa rather than Asia, but it was just a guess based on a similarity to African apes. It wasn't based on a fossil record. Today, we now know that there are more than 20 species of hominins that have been identified in the fossil record. There's great debate about actually how many species, but there are at least 20. Some of which Yohannes has found. As an aside, he has one of the best abilities to find fossils. Pattern recognition for finding fossils is a highly evolved skill, and Yohannes is one of the most brilliant fossil discoverers and is able to analyze them with great ability as well, and has been a major contributor. So it's been fun to write about his work over the years. These fossils appear about 6 to 7 million years ago in Africa. That timeline for the origins of humans would have surprised Darwin because we did not have the dating revolution at that time. So they evolved in Africa, as he said, about 6 to 7 million years ago. And then it isn't until 2 million years ago that we find fossils out of Africa. And at that point, an ancestor called Homo erectus was able to trek far and wide and made it all the way to Java in Indonesia and spreads around the globe rapidly. These fossils show that upright walking came before tool use in the big brain, a sequence of events that Darwin got wrong. But given the fact he didn't have fossils, it's not surprising. He couldn't figure that out. Today, researchers are still debating why hominins began walking upright in Africa around 5 to 7 million years ago. One person in an audience I spoke to once said maybe it was to dance. Who knows? Hopefully we'll get answers to that question over time. Both Jeremy and Yohannes are both working on that. The other major revolution that's happened in the past decade that is really important to note is the study of ancient DNA. And from that, we have learned that we were not alone. Until recently, we had other kinds of humans around, Neanderthals and Denisovans. We discovered new kinds of humans. And for most of human evolution, there were multiple types of humans around, which is mind-blowing to think what it would have been like to have encountered other kinds of hominins. It never ceases to amaze me to think about that. I also want to underscore that the revolution in methods has changed how we study fossils. It has made it not only possible to date them or to get the DNA from their bones to identify who they were, but we've learned from isotopes what they ate. We've learned about their sex. We've learned what kind of diseases they had. All these new tools have brought these ancient hominins alive and showed us the many different ways to be human. It would have been fascinating to tell Darwin about these studies. The other thing they've shown us is that humans today are genetically very similar. There's only one species of hominin on the planet left, and we have less genetic diversity as a species than any two chimpanzees from different troops, even though there's too few chimpanzees left or gorillas. This is really important, and it brings me to Agustín Fuentes' really important chapter on race, how closely related we are, and that there are no biological differences. The race is not a biological concept. He talks eloquently about how Darwin knew that races were not separate species and shared more with each other than they differed, which was more enlightened than many scholars of his time. But he still was a man of his time and believed in the hierarchy of races, and he showed his own bias against Africans and African descendants, which is probably the most harmful assertion that Darwin ever made. His ideas about the hierarchy of race gave foundation for the eugenics movement, Jim Crow laws, and white supremacy, which is still with us. I just heard recently that 14% of Americans are white supremacist, which is shocking. And as Agustín said, they do draw on Darwin and what many of us who write about evolution publish, but often out of context. So one of the most important things we can do as scientists and communicators is educate the public about race. There is no biological basis, that it's a social construct, that traits like skin color or height don't cluster in races, that our differences that we see today in humans on the planet are adaptations to different habitats, climates, diseases, and diets, and that they're a very small part of our genome. So to go on from there, Darwin also was wrong about the superiority of men to women. Holly Dunsworth wins the award for the best title in this book, This View of Wife, which is an amazing title. One of his most glaring blind spots was that women evolved to be wives. The quote is, "Man is more courageous, pugnacious, and energetic than women and has a more inventive genius." I don't even know how to respond to it. I'm just going to sigh. As Holly said, his book is better for birds, beagles, baboons than it was for humans. I think she has done a better job than I can in debunking that. I don't even know that we need to. It reminds me very much of Virginia Woolf's book, A Room of One's Own, that Darwin, if only we could have given women at the time more opportunity to be pugnacious, to be energetic, to be more inventive, that the opportunity has to be there to show them what they're capable of. Finally, I think that it's important as we think about this book. I mean, it bequeathed us, it gave us a roadmap to think about human evolution. For that, it is incredibly important. It inspired a race around the planet to look for fossils. It doesn't diminish Darwin, but it also gives us a warning that we learn from observing nature, but what we see in the behavior of other primates and in our own societies is always biased by our own background, our own time that we live in, our own filters, like Darwin had. The stories we tell about human evolution always reflect the storyteller and his or her biases, including mine. I wish we could have dinner with Darwin now so he could respond to some of these, some of the new things we've discovered, especially about race and gender, and make corrections. So now I want to open it up to questions, and I'll move to that.
Hi, Anne. I think we're going to be inviting everyone back in now. Yeah, here they come.
Great.
Thank you so much for summarizing all of those brilliant talks.
So for questions, should I start finding questions and asking them? I think we'll start right off the bat. Is Yohannes there? So a question,
yes, I am.
That's wonderful. We got a question. By the count today, how many hominin species do we think lived at the same time as Homo sapiens? I guess is what they're asking. Same time as us, so I'm assuming they mean Homo sapiens.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good question. It depends on which species we recognize as valid. But if we think about like all the named species like Homo naledi, Homo heidelbergensis, of course, that's probably the ancestor. We can say at some time there were at least 3 species or 2 species, 3 max, 2 minimum. Neanderthals and modern humans overlapped, we know that. And if Homo naledi is a valid species, it overlapped with Homo sapiens. Homo heidelbergensis probably overlapped with Homo sapiens if the North African discoveries, which are now dated to about 300,000, are actually members of our own species, Homo sapiens. So these are like some of the overlaps that we see in the fossil record. But again, as I said, it all depends on the validity of these taxa that we're identifying in the fossil record.
Thank you, Yohannes. So we had a question early on from Bernard Wood. Hello, Bernard. You asked what we thought of Darwin's ability as a science writer. I'm going to ask Janet Browne to help me with that. I will say briefly that he's very clear, he's very direct, not strong on narrative. Or character development, but Janet might have some thoughts.
Oh, well, for all of us who are interested in that question, Darwin struggled hugely to make himself clear. He worked over and over and over each paragraph to reduce the length of his sentences, to keep the verbs active, to all the sorts of things we learn in school. So he struggled to be clear. And there are, unfortunately, I think, myself, lots of passages where he's not clear, where he gets himself in a tangle. And if you have undergraduates reading the book with you, it's sometimes very difficult because he's not using words or concepts that we are now familiar with. It's a period book. And I think if we approach both the origin of species and the descent of man with that in mind, it's a period book. It's like reading Charles Dickens. It's of its time. And you have to hunt around. I'm sure Anne has had to do that for little bits that are going to illuminate one's own articles where Darwin's actually concise, even pithy about things. So I don't think he's a great stylist myself.
That's great. Thank you, Janet. We have a question from Alice Corning. She asks, at every age we are affected by the current thinking, where might our current blind spots lie? And I think we had Holly start to answer that at one point. I don't know who wants to take that one on. I could direct it. Does anybody have a desire? Agustín?
Holly, go for it.
Holly, go for it.
We literally answered this question in our discussion before your talk, Anne. I think from Alice.
My apologies. Okay.
Am I?
We had similar.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
I don't know if anybody else wanted to do that. I like the question.
I do too.
What we did talk about.
Can I interject? Sorry, Agustín. The thing about blind spots is that we're blind to them. So it's very difficult to talk about where we are going wrong in these sorts of matters. We can, of course, identify race, sex, and gender as being issues that we should be better on, but maybe there's something else that we just don't see.
I think, though, we can also, I mean, that's true. Blind spots by definition are blind, but blind to whom, right? I think by listening more to more diverse voices and participants, we get to see what are blind spots. And by our, I mean the sort of standard academy, right? So when academics expand out, or when we expand who can be academics, we see new critiques and new engagement. So the real argument, and there's great data on this, that diversity in scholarship, right? Diverse scholars doing scholarship on the same topic actually improves our ability by highlighting different perspectives, different lived experiences, and those blind spots become more visible.
David Bard asks, to what extent do you think Darwin's pessimistic views on competition were influenced by his encounter with General Rosas during the Beagle voyage? Janet, I'm going to ask you that one unless anybody else has insight on that.
Well, he certainly did encounter Colonel General Rosas. He found it an anxious moment because he wished to have permission to travel further into Patagonia. Thought perhaps he might be denied that. The encounter specifically with the brutality that was being exerted by the Rosas troops against the peoples of Argentina appalled him. It was just dreadful. So I think possibly, even long before he came up with a notion of natural selection, long after he returned from the Beagle voyage, he had a strong sense of the brutality of the world, both human and natural. And that clearly, I think, feeds into his sense that competition, selections, death, and survival were the right answer to the problems he was looking at.
Kamala Smith asks Yohannes, I'm interested that you seem to indicate that the larger brain has made us more dominant. Would Browne never have won out? So brains versus strength. Can you answer that, Yohannes?
I can try. So when we say big brain helped us dominate the whole world, it's not simply the size. It's also about how the brain faculties are partitioned, and we have a much better thought processing and memory, and that's what gives us really an advantage. So it's not simply about size per se, but it's really interesting that Darwin also addressed this issue of size, strength versus intelligence in the same book, Descent of Man. And I was looking at some of the text, and here's what he said about bodily size or strength relative to intelligence. So I quote, in regard to bodily size or strength, we do not know whether man is descended from some comparatively small species like the chimpanzee or from one as powerful as the gorilla. And therefore, we cannot say whether man has become larger and stronger or smaller and weaker in comparison to his progenitors. We should, however, bear in mind that an animal possessing great size, strength, and ferocity, and which, like the gorilla, could defend itself from all enemies, would probably, though not necessarily, have failed to become social, and thus would most effectually have checked the acquirement by man of his higher mental qualities, such as sympathy and the love of his fellow creatures. That's what he said in his book. So what we're seeing here is it's not just about strength. What really mattered was the intelligence that they got from the reorganization of the brain, which also happens to be enlarged from their predecessors.
Scott Solomon asks, what are the best ways to share what we know about human evolution and Darwin's role in history with the public without glorifying Darwin and perpetuating his incorrect and problematic views?
Let me just briefly jump in. I think it's really, really important to talk about evolutionary understandings, processes in science without just connecting them to Darwin. Since Darwin, we've learned a lot. And so bringing Darwin as part and parcel of the evolutionary sciences is important, but there's so much that's happened, transpired in the last 150 years. And there's so much diversity and perspective and theoretical advancement in evolutionary biology. We're in a much different place. And so presenting it that way, and also presenting the problems with a lot of the last 150 years of presentation of these data and knowledges. I think that's really important. I think Darwin in context can do a lot of good. Darwin out of context, how he's usually used, can be quite harmful.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Agustín. If Darwin had never been born, those fossils that Yohannes finds, he'd still be finding them. We would still know about molecular genetics, and we'd still be able to look at how different species on Earth are related to each other. We would still be using our understanding of comparative behavior, like Brian does, to try to figure out the origins of things like sociality in humans and morality in humans. So evolution would still be something that we would be talking about and understanding and trying to figure out, even if Darwin had never existed. There were people talking about that before Darwin, and talking about it after. So I think, as Agustín said, he can be the starting point or a launching point for conversations about evolution. But we don't necessarily have to lionize him and idolize him for having some of the first words on this, because it didn't have to be him. It could have been someone else. And in fact, Alfred Russel Wallace was thinking of these same ideas at that time as well.
We have a question. Would Darwin have changed his opinion on indigenous peoples, especially people in Africa, if he'd known more of them? If after the Beagle, he didn't travel much, and if he'd actually spent time with them? This was a question for Agustín and Holly, but I could see any of you answering that. Let's start with Agustín. Do you think it would have changed his views at all if he'd known them?
No, I don't. And I think Janet should weigh in on this. I mean, I think it's pretty clear he did have some connections, and he had interfaces with folks in throughout his life, less and less as he got older. But he was exposed and did have some really critical, and in his own journals, he really notes his impression of being with others and how similar they were. So I'm not sure that more exposure would have made the difference, but maybe different kinds of exposure or immersion would have. I don't know enough about, I don't know if it would have.
So if I can chip in, I do support exactly what Agustín has said. Remember that on the Beagle voyage, not only were they traveling to many different places in the world, they had on board 3 indigenous peoples from Tierra del Fuego who were being repatriated, having been taken to Britain in order to be Christianized by the captain, and then the captain was intending to land them back in their home country, in order to set up a religious mission. So Darwin had plenty of really close opportunities to get to know people, and he did get to know at least one of them, Ol Horeniku, who enchanted him, who he was friends with in, I suppose one could say, a limited way. So I think Agustin's exactly right. He had plenty of opportunity. He took those opportunities. He did actually know indigenous peoples, and he came up with the views that we know he came up with.
Very interesting. We have a question about religion. One of our questions is that Darwin seemed to be able to take on the church. Why not his other cultural certainties, other biases? I would guess that would be Janet.
No one wants to jump into this, Janet.
Yeah.
Really?
Oh, I was going to say Holly.
Whoever knows.
Whoever knows.
So I think the whole concept of Darwin taking on the church is misconstrued. Darwin had a very interesting and complex relationship with faith traditions, with Christianity. And, you know, a lot of people have made an enormous amount about that. But I would say Darwin went to great lengths not to take on the church in some ways. And that I think it's a misconstrual to sort of make these opposite. Now, the reaction to Darwin's work by many, but not by no means all, practicing Christians and others are well known. I think there's a lot made about this horrendous conflict, and I'm not sure, it was powerful for Darwin, but I'm not sure that's the right, I don't think Darwin took on the church. Janet, I mean.
No, I don't believe he did. Over his long lifetime, he became increasingly agnostic. And that was known. You know, once he became famous, people wrote about that in the newspapers. But it's not taking on the church. The theory took on the church. The supporters took on the church. Darwin himself was always rather socially conservative and had many Victorian clergymen in his family. He didn't wish to antagonize. He didn't wish to slap it in people's faces, I think, basically. Yes.
And yet he was an out-of-the-box thinker, right? I mean, he was able to take these observations that others had access to and piece them together in a way that we're still talking about 150 years later, or even more with Origin of Species. So that's what I struggle with, is that for somebody who was able to see the world in a very different way than his contemporaries had done, he still couldn't get out of his own way when it came to his biases about being a white male, which to me illustrates sort of the power of that bias and the danger of that bias.
So speaking of bias, we have another question. This would be for Brian Hare. We've heard about how Darwin's bias impacted race and gender. How did it impact his views on morality?
Wow. I'm not sure I know how to answer that question, other than to say, you know, he was open in thinking about morality not coming from a divine author. And that, you know, for the first time, we have an idea in this book that you have this purposeless natural force leading to moral behavior in humans, and that animals may have components of that. I mean, I don't really, and I think that's partly, maybe there was a question about anthropomorphizing and the danger of maybe seeing human-like skills and behaviors in animals. And if there is a bias there, it would be that he seemed to be quite open to anthropomorphizing animals, and that may have given him some willingness to see love or sympathy in their behavior. And so that in my own field, and animal psychology, is something that is always argued about, the degree to which we can actually understand animal minds, how similar or different they are to our own, and how do we deal with our own bias of seeing human-like traits in other animals. And of course, he was not making or writing with the benefit of any experiments. And the idea of an experimental approach is that through careful controls and manipulations, you can sort of rule out some of the lower level explanations that might help you to attribute richer cognitive ability. So that's the best I can do on that one.
That's great, Brian. I'm eager to follow up on your work and hear more about what else you're testing in animals, how you're continuing to test these ideas, what the experiments are. It's a really exciting area. I thought we'd wrap up now. This is Jerry's idea, and I think it's a good one. Let's imagine we're at dinner with Darwin and do the round table discussion. If I went around to each of you, what would you tell Darwin? What would you like to tell him that he got right or wrong? What would you say to him now? And let's start with Agustín.
I'd pull out a bunch of the data. I'd challenge the data he's using, the Civil War surgeons and these others, for human variation, and I'd put data that were available during his time on the table and ask him to, let's spend some time. Let's actually look at what's going on. I don't know that that would work, but it would give me great pleasure to say the data are here, and you're a data man. If you can't get it, you're wrong. And I think he would find it fascinating, and we'd see where it goes.
I love that you thought of it that way, that you'd like to sit down and share the data with him, and that he was a good scientist and be open to it. So we can take an optimistic view perhaps on that. Janet, what would you say to him?
I'd want to go back to the discussion we had a moment or two ago, and I suspect I might even be a little bit rude to him. And I would ask, how can you be so radical in your thinking and so socially conservative? And I think he would find that offensive.
Mm. And he was conservative as in the way he lived as well.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Exactly. Very, very interesting. Stuck close to home, and yeah, very interesting. Holly, what would you say or ask him?
So I'm really stumped. A lot of people, and I understand, they like to delight in thinking, what would Darwin think? It's a theme in the book and beyond. And I don't think that way. It's hard for me, I have not tried to, and maybe it's because I'm angry with him, tried to think what he's thinking, or cared much about him as a person and learning more about him as a person, because he makes me so angry. And to ask to even imagine being at dinner with him is emotional for me and stressful for me, that I can't think of something I would say, which means I probably, why would I even be there? Not that I would decline an invitation, but why would I even be invited? It's too hypothetical. And I don't think that way about him, even though I will continue to teach with him, because he had an astounding view of nature and our place in it. And it's so easy to follow in his footsteps and put together change over deep time and relatedness of all living things. I mean, it's the perfect way to teach evolution. So, he's not ever going to be dead to me. It's not like that. And I just can't imagine being at dinner with him. So I sorry for the long answer, but I have no answer for your question.
Maybe we better leave him in his century so he doesn't trigger all of our students. So it's actually, you know, I'm having fun with a thought experiment, but not everybody is, right? And
Yeah, I probably would have asked him something just about like, what was it like to put a beetle in your mouth that time when you had one in each hand and you had nowhere else to put the third, you know, or what was it like to bite the claws off a kitten? That was weird. Like, that's fun. You know, I probably would have said something like that, and nothing to do with how horrible his book is. You know,
yeah,
how it would have played out.
That's great. Yohannes, what about you? What would you like to?
Well, I would have mentioned a lot of the things that he talked about, like in relation to race and stuff like that, but I would concentrate on his ideas about human origins. So the first thing I'll tell him is like commend him for actually identifying the key characteristics that distinguishes us from other animals. That's like a very good point that I will make. But I will also tell him that I don't think he got the sequence right. And secondly, I'm convinced that freeing the hands was the reason why we have to become bipedal. And I tell him, you haven't figured out why we became bipedal, which I think we don't know yet, even 150 years later. So that's what I would tell him.
Why do you think we became bipedal? Do you have any ideas?
I wish. I wish I knew. I wish I knew.
And
that
then
would be a long conversation.
Brian, what would you like to talk to him about or tell me?
Well, first I would tell him how great the Leakey Foundation is for doing an event like this, and you know, tell him Jerry is the man for organizing all of this and all these people, and how fun it's been to be together with you. And a lot of the people that are like heroes of mine, I'm sitting here getting to talk about this all, so it's amazing to be together. But in seriousness, I would take him to the DRC. And I would introduce him to bonobos, because I think it would challenge a lot of his ideas about sexual selection. And I think he would delight. I think he would be thrilled to hear that female choice can be so powerful in shaping males, and that friendly males, in the case of bonobos, the most successful males are actually male bonobos. They have more offspring. The most successful male bonobos have more offspring than the most successful despotic chimpanzee males who are big and dominant alpha. I think he would love that. I think he would be thrilled by that, and it would really shape his thinking. So I think that would be where I would talk less, and I would say, let's go see bonobos.
You go on safari with Darwin. What a cool idea.
Love it. Oh, so
Jerry, what about you? You get the last word here, because you put this together.
Yeah, so I would let him know that in 1864, while he was feeling quite ill and staying at his sister-in-law's house, that he held in his hand, without knowing it, the skull of a Neanderthal. That he had the evidence for human ancestry in his hands and didn't see it, didn't recognize it, and thought it was just a didn't know what it was. He wrote very little about it, just a throwaway sentence in a letter to a friend, that he had a 50,000-year-old Neanderthal skull in his hand in 1864. And then I'd show him all the other fossils we've found since then. But that's what I would share with him.
Yeah, I was blown away when I visited his house how close he was to Swanscombe, where this famous fossil was discovered. All those years is buried very close to his house. It's kind of amazing to think the tantalizing clues that were there. Well, I think this is it for our question and answer time. Jerry, you're going to read the...
Yeah, so that this concludes this concludes our event. I am so fortunate to have colleagues such as these that these folks you see here. I want to thank you so much. Thank you, Janet, Brian, Yohannes, Agustín, Holly, and Anne for really seeing the vision that I had for this book, and then seeing it through. And I'm so proud of what we produced. Thank you to the Leakey Foundation for organizing this amazing day. I'm particularly grateful to Camilla Smith, Ariel Johnson, Meredith Johnson, and Cheryl Camisa for their continued support for science education and human evolution research. For over 50 years, the Leakey Foundation has been dedicated to exploration, discovery, and sharing the human story. They're driven to answer the big questions about what makes us human. They fund the scientific research that seeks to answer these questions and share discoveries through exceptional programs like the one today, their lunch break science web series, and award-winning podcast, Origin Stories. To learn more about the Leakey Foundation, how you can help support origin research and educational programs like this, please visit leakeyfoundation.org. I also want to thank our editor of the book at Princeton University Press, Allison Collette, and the entire team who helped make this idea a reality. And for those of you interested in learning more about what we talked about today, please check out A Most Interesting Problem. Not only will you hear from the folks who spoke today, but there are 5 other chapters from amazing scientists who expand on the topics that we covered. So thank you all for watching, and have a great rest of your weekend.